single day that have an impact. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and we've heard quite a bit about this, is creating the platform for transparency. When we have better information, when there's transparency in what's happening, whether it's at the product level, whether it's at the government level on how things are being spent, whatever it is, it drives accountability. So in any sort of technology solution or any process, we need to think about how we can increase the transparency. That way we start to get these big tipping points of people saying, this isn't acceptable behavior, right? We can't continue to do this to our rivers. We can't continue to do this to our air, for example. And then the third thing is we need to continue to focus on innovation. I've heard a lot at this conference, well, is it a technology problem? Is it a political problem? Is it a people problem? And I really think that we can't stop innovating on technology.
You made an interesting comment in the discussion before this panel in terms of the word sustainability itself, that there's a kind of static, perhaps even non-innovative. Could you amplify on that?
Sure. So when I think about sustainability, I think to sustain, and in a lot of people's minds that might mean to not prosper. And I go back and forth on this. I think I've told you an example of being in different countries, and I think, well, is this more sustainable than the country that I live in? Well, maybe, but is the quality of life as good, right? Are people living a prosperous life? So I like to think of in terms of prosperity and not necessarily just sustainability.
Awesome.
So it may be semantics to some people, but it's the notion that we're going to continue to do better for everything.
So you mentioned three things: engaging with people, transparency, and the platform.
Right.
What are examples that encapsulate these three or illustrate these three principles?
I'm going to use an example. I learned about this probably about a year ago, and then I had the opportunity recently on a visit to India to meet with the Indian Space Research Organization. And they have been working for the last 8 years or so on community watershed projects. And they've been doing that specifically in a region called Karnataka. And they've been working with farmers to educate them on the health of the watershed, as well as on different practices from an irrigation perspective, from an animal husbandry perspective, on how they can not only improve their own economic status, but as well as preserve some of the watershed. And they did this using technology, right? Using satellite imagery, as well as being able to account for what these people's behaviors were based on that information and communication technology. I'm Intel, right? So I have to talk about the importance there. But giving the community members the information, educating them, and then also holding them accountable and letting them make some of those decisions, right? It's once again giving people the right tools to make those decisions.
So let me ask you this, having lived in Karnataka, and I think I spent about 10 years in Karnataka, in that particular state where Bangalore is the capital. So one issue that comes up is getting them to adopt this technology, this difficulty in understanding, embracing, and adopting this. What's your sense of the challenges that might have been faced there, or in other settings like this?
So I think in any point in time, there's one, people just trying to understand how to use these things. So there's the education aspect, but then there's also the understanding what is going to incentivize them to use it, right? Is it going to make their lives better? And some of that's hard to do if you don't have a good common language to be able to communicate that through. But if you are able to work with people and continue until they get to see the benefits, because it has to be a benefit to their life, right? I mean, why else would we adopt things unless it's going to be a benefit? Some people
Personal
will,
benefit.
but for them it was a benefit. And once they started to understand that their crop yields were increasing. So in this case, crop yields increased from about between 6 and 15%. So that's economic improvements in their lives. And so once people understand, we heard another panel up here earlier, I think she was our psychologist friend, talk about what is it that helps people adopt technology, right? You either make something, or adopt any sort of behavior. You make things so painful on one end, or on such a benefit on the other, right? And the other part of that was penalizing people who didn't obey the community plan. right? So there was also this oversight for people's behaviors. So it is the carrot and the stick.
And then if you take the perspective of the service provider, so the question that comes up, I'm sure Intel has faced this, is how do you monetize this? You know, there's clearly benefit on the customer side, but the service provider, where's the revenue? What's your sense, the business model? What's your thoughts on that?
So it's complicated, right? And I think in any of these sort of wicked problems that we're all going to try to solve, the business models are complicated, but you have to look and see who are all the beneficiaries of this service, of this data, et cetera. Let me give you another example. This is one that Intel's actually doing we're testing it out in West Oakland, California, in poor areas of the city, and we've come up with an air quality monitoring device that attaches to a phone. And what we're doing is providing this to community members, and they feel empowered because they, for once, have true access into what their air quality is. So you ask, what is the business model, right? I'm getting there. So the business model is there's multiple people who want to know what the air quality is. There's the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, who says this is great. If we can deliver these low-cost quality sensors and get much better data, we're in. You look at the state of California, who also says this is great. This helps us as far as our management of air quality. They're in. You look at the city itself, same sort of scenario, and then you look at these community groups, and it gives them a voice because they have the data. So I think it's looking at the multiple wins across any sort of business scenario.
And so when they're in, so how do they pay for it? How is revenue generated off them? Any sense on that?
So I think this is where you have to look at what are the different, am I going in and out? I kind of thought, okay. That is a little better. I was wondering, whoa. So in cases where there's who pays for the initial technology deployment, right? Who pays for the actual hardware? And that may be different than who pays for each amount of data or the recurring revenue streams, right? It could be something on a monthly basis. It could be transactional. And so it can be very different as far as who's providing.
And I guess those are the things to be worked out. Those are the hard ones.
Actually, if I may add to this, what Carrie is saying is, sometimes a business model is the redefinition of government and private sector. In the case of the Indian Space Institute and the water, government is supposed to provide water, or provide the thinking of water. So it's not the definition of the past that everything that you do on water has to have a gate money and therefore is profitable. The beneficiaries are the community, and therefore the community benefits, and therefore government actually stays in power or not in power based on that. So I think there's an emerging model which is saying that the government is investing in new technology. By new technology, you mean specifically focused on the vertical.
Capital there.
Absolutely, which is water management. And water is a scarce resource, therefore how do we actually work together to happen? So I think inherently this idea of only a revenue model and saying that there is in fact an income from it is not definitely to the person who researches it, but there may be an income to the person who's the beneficiary of it. I think Carrie alluded to that.
Right.
And actually, this is a good time. Jim, Alison, any questions for Carrie? Any comments you may have? Or
I think it's just changing our set of stakeholders. It's changing our stakeholders from a business point of view. And if we continue to just look at this internally and not consider all the customer markets, then we aren't going to be able to innovate. So it is about changing the business model as we know it today, I think.
Understand. Well, this might be a good time to segue to, there we go. So Alison, you're the executive director of the entire sustainability practice at Fujitsu. And you also set up the consulting practice.
I did. So I'm responsible for the 69 countries outside of Japan. And I thought I'd actually tell a little bit of a story to put that into perspective. My introduction to sustainability was through a business decision about 7 years ago, and it was before I started working for Fujitsu. And I was faced with a decision that I could put 156,000 lithium batteries into landfill, or I could make an environmental choice and develop a new process and think about how I could actually treat that quite differently. So